Darwin Day lecture at Franklin and Marshall. Yeah, it's nice to be able to say that, isn't it? I think we've actually got a tradition going here. We have had speakers in the past on a number of topics related to Darwin and his work, or the culture out of which that work grew. We've begun to branch out in recent years into a somewhat broader range of topics that are relevant to the general period or to the history of science broadly. And this year we're really pleased to have with us Andy Curran from Wesleyan University, who's written an absolutely sensational biography of Diderot, the French philosophe, who in many ways, I think I came away from this biography realizing this guy practically single-handedly constructed the modern world of science-based policy. And I mean the very world that we see being deconstructed around us right now. And that's one reason why I thought he would make such a great speaker this year. I cannot highly enough recommend the book. I look at it and I say, when will I ever be able to write like that? It's just so accessible, no matter what you do or don't know about the middle of the 18th century. So I also turned, not long after that, to a book that he wrote in 2011, The Anatomy of Blackness, Science and Slavery in an Age of Enlightenment. And I know my history of medicine students read a chunk of this earlier this week. And to look at 18th century French Enlightenment scholars, people who are really at the leading edge of liberalism in the 18th century, arguing about theories of race and how to explain why some people are black, why some people are white, what are their reasons for thinking that one or the other is the original color of the human race, is really quite fascinating and gives you just incredible insight into the world we live in today. Andy tells me that he was contacted recently by Henry Louis Gates and that they're working together on a volume of an essay contest from the 1840s in Bordeaux, where essayists from all over Europe were invited to submit arguments about the origin of human blackness. If this is not going to be a great teaching volume, I don't know what is. I'm really looking forward to using it. Maybe in the Q&A you can get to talk more about that if you're interested in it. So, Andrew Curran has a BA in French from Hamilton College, an MA in French literature from NYU in Paris, another MA from Wesleyan University, a PhD from NYU in French literature. He's currently the William Armstrong Professor of the Humanities at Wesleyan University, where he also served from 2011 to 2015 as Dean of the Arts and Humanities. Please give a warm Darwin Day welcome to Andrew Curran.
Thank you so much. Am I coming through loud and clear here, all the way, both sides of the room? Great. Thank you so much, Jim and Lisa and the French department and sciences in general for organizing this fabulous day, and Melissa for helping me out today as I'm trying to get organized. It's a real pleasure to be here, to come into this part of the country, which is so beautiful. It's a nice drive from Philadelphia, which we did this morning. And I'm really just happy to come talk to you all about Diderot and his kind of tangential link to Darwin. And particularly in the context of free thinking, because free thinking, as Jim has said, is somewhat under fire these days. And I just want to say I could have spoken about a lot of different Diderots to you today. Diderot is a polymath. He did everything. He's just such an astonishing genius. And let me tell you, it's difficult to write about a genius when you're not one. It's an initial kind of challenge when you get into a topic like this. So this guy is the founder of art criticism. He is the author of drippingly sentimental bourgeois dramas that I'm not going to talk to you about today at all. He's a theorist of the fourth wall we talk about. He's a man who wrote with authority on mathematics, the life sciences, medicine, literature, and musicology. He's also a cagey encyclopedist, an impresario, the co-editor of the great Encyclopédie, the great persecuted Encyclopédie project. which was arguably the greatest book of the 18th century. I'm not going to talk about that today. I could have talked about Diderot the sexologist, who was so admired by Freud. Diderot, the author of some of the greatest love letters of the 18th century. Diderot, the post-colonial thinker, or the political theorist, the man who traveled to St. Petersburg to meet Catherine the Great, to speak to her about political theory, and he also recommended to her that she make the lives of the serfs in Imperial Russia a little nicer. I could have also talked about Diderot, the commentator on the American Revolution, who in 1776 writes the American Revolutionaries. He calls them insurgents, by the way. He writes the insurgents who are fighting a war of independence against Britain at the time, and warns these same Americans that the greatest danger to this new American country would not be from foreign powers, but from its own accumulation of wealth and the concentration of power within the hands of only a few men, and the potential rise of a tyrant. 1776. But today I decided to talk about the heretic. I've been asked to talk about Diderot the heretic, the unbeliever, the skeptic, the proponent of a particular kind of radical empiricism, the proto-Darwinian, and we can talk about how proto he is, a Darwinian thinker, somebody who actually, I think the historians of science would call him a transformist thinker. But before I get into that, I should introduce you a little bit more to Diderot and answer the question, who is this guy and why is this 18th century Frenchman of interest to us today? So Diderot is born in 1713 in this small town we have up here. He's the son of a cutler, somebody who makes surgical instruments, in this little small city of Langres, L-A-N-G-R-E-S. Pronounce with me, Langres. Excellent. This table, the French table back there? Langres. Langres. Excellent. Okay, so Langres is home of excellent cheese. There are 7,000 or 8,000 people living there in the 18th century. Today, there are 7,000 or 8,000 people living there. It has not changed very much. It's an isolated and walled city. It looks like a Game of Thrones set, very much so. You have to walk up from the train station. And in the 18th century, it's a very religious city, where the biorhythms of life were determined and regimented by the Archbishop of Langres. This is kind of a typical situation in the 18th century. The church is providing the intellectual and spiritual framework for daily reality. What was more, religious practice and sacraments were enforced by the local government and police. Think about it. Given the fact that salvation and the afterlife were matters of incredible public concern, the state levied fines on parents who do not christen their newborns within a day's time. It's kind of like vaccination against eternal damnation. And the authorities also would, watch over who was going to catechism. Neglectful mothers and fathers were told that if they didn't take their kids to catechism, they would be denied the sacrament of penance on their deathbed. And Diderot grew up in this exact kind of religious household. His brother becomes a priest. His sister becomes a nun. She dies in a convent after going completely mad. And he's lucky enough to be in a family. Where. I may have to go analog here. He grows up in a family where they have enough money for him to attend school, which is, of course, a Jesuit school. And at age 14, I'm going analog, that's okay. Maybe this froze. Your computer may have frozen. That's okay, I'll just keep talking. Oh, there we go, thank you so much. And so at age 14, he leaves Paris because he's an excellent student. He goes up to Paris to become a priest. And to Sorbonne, which is the faculty of theology. You have to understand the 18th century, the universities were not places where you would kind of create knowledge. They were places where you kept knowledge static. Scientific academies were where they were doing experiments. And so Diderot goes to Sorbonne, which is to become a priest. And by the early 20s, he drops out. And he spends 10 years being something of a dilettante. This said, he did teach himself English by using a Latin-English dictionary because his Latin was so good. And then becomes a translator and the author of a scandalous anonymous novel and heretical works of philosophy to which I will return. And most famously, Diderot became the editor of the real comprehensive encyclopedia, a massive undertaking that I alluded to earlier, and he's going to end up dedicating his life to this. Now, very briefly now that we've got the slide back, here's a view of Langres in about 1840 on the left, and here's an image I got from Google Maps, kind of driving around the town with my computer. I spent a lot of time there too. But you can see things have really not changed very much. In the 18th century, there was a big marble cross in the central square, and now there's a statue of Diderot. So we have a big kind of shift going on there in the town of Langres. Okay, so the Encyclopedia. The Encyclopedia is 17 volumes of text, 11 volumes of plates, 3,000 individually printed and compiled illustrations, 74,000 articles, 23,000 cross-references and hyperlinks. It's really the first major comprehensive encyclopedia in the history of the human species. Diderot oversaw the entire thing. He wrote 7,000 articles for this. Students in the audience should think about that when they're having writer's block. 7,000 articles. He wrote on things ranging from the political authority of the king to the traditions of the people of Benin in West Africa. Now, before I get to his writing, I want to remind people a little bit more about the context of what it was like to write during this time, particularly when you're challenging authorities. The Ancien Régime monarchy, the French monarchy in the 18th century, had aspects of a theocracy. In addition to the fact that Louis XV was always surrounded by conservative religious priests at court, the French police also had so many spies on the lookout for heterodox ideas that it was like Soviet Moscow at times. And this brings it to 1749. At this point, Diderot is 35 years old. And he had been editor of the Encyclopedia, along with his buddy D'Alembert, for a couple of years. And in 1749, two gendarmes show up at his apartment to arrest him and take him to the Château de Vincennes prison, for his atheistic book, The Letter on the Blind, and another book called The Bijoux Indiscrets, or The Indiscreet Jewels, which was something like the Vagina Monologues. I'll get back the letter immediately. So, in Vincennes, here's the prison right here, which is still, you can still visit outside of Paris. He's put in solitary confinement, and he remains there because he refuses to admit that he wrote these books for a while. And after 2 months in the chateau's dungeon, and in French the dungeon is that tower where he's by himself, he finally admits that he wrote these things. And the authorities are delighted because they've taken this kind of philosopher and they've really kind of tortured him, not physically, but they've tortured him. And as he's leaving, a guy by the name of the Marquis d'Argenson, whose brother actually was responsible for locking Diderot up, recorded in his diary. When Diderot emerged from his cell, he seemed a broken man. He was preoccupied, dazed, and withdrawn. He also concluded that Diderot's state was a testament to the man's weak mind, his damaged imagination, and the fact that his senseless brilliance had been easily subdued. Now, this guy was right to a certain extent. When Diderot returned to Paris in November of 1749, he did so with his tail between his legs. And knowing full well that there were spies all over Paris, he refrained from publishing anything truly scandalous for the rest of his career, which is exactly another 35 years. But he was far from entirely silenced. First of all, he is going to publish his ideas in this fantastic encyclopedia, which is very important for people like Thomas Jefferson. And he's also going to create a bunch of hidden writings, which he destines for the tiroir, or the drawer. So he's just going to kind of think about publishing later, or thinking about publishing for an audience much later. And so this is his strategy of targeting posterity. He was thinking about talking to us. That was his idea. One of his favorite expressions was, posterity is for the philosopher what heaven is for the man of religion. He also bragged that one does one's best writing from the grave. And he was thinking that that once his books would appear, they would explode like bombs after he was gone. And this is exactly what they did. And so let me talk now in the next part of my little conference here today about what it was like to become a free thinker during the 18th century. I've already talked about Langres But I want to talk about belief itself. To grow up in 18th century France as a believer was to have access to a plenum, a world of staggering fullness, coherence, and meaning. Science was not about the disinterested quest for truth regarding the natural world. French universities, as I said, were not involved in pushing back the frontiers of knowledge. They were designed to replicate knowledge. The Sorbonne, as I said, was a faculty of theology, a priest factory. The laws of nature were guaranteed by God. Morality was guaranteed by God. Political authority was guaranteed by God. The sacraments were guaranteed by God, of course, and these were milestones that led you to salvation. I'll give you one example of how this works today here on Darwin Day. According to calculations that had been made by literalist interpreters of the Bible during the Renaissance, the world had been created 5,700 years before. And to assert something different could be seen as heretical, or was seen as heretical. Now, it's incredibly hard to give this up. It's something I think we don't realize. It's incredibly hard to give up that fullness, this world of meaning. And to kind of break free of these time scales that said that the world is 5,700 years old. But to do so was to take the first step toward the radically different understanding of the world we see taking shape in the 19th century and also in the 18th century as well. And I should say that Diderot didn't start his career as an atheist, although French biographers try to make him into an atheist inside his cradle. Like many philosophers, Diderot started off as a deist, somebody who believed that religion was something that is practiced by humans and had actually gotten in the way with one's relationship to God. Now, what does it mean being a deist exactly? A deist eschews scripture, mocks the belief in particular providence, the idea that there's a God who's looking down at every single thing that happens on earth, and then replace it with an idea of a faraway clockmaker, a deus absconditus, a faraway kind of God who really doesn't, has created the world but not really worried about what happens afterwards. And this brings us to one of Diderot's first translations. This is a book that he does, translates the Shaftesbury English philosopher. And very quickly, I want to make 3 points about what Diderot asserts in here. He's a very liberally minded translator, so he's actually kind of riffing on a lot of the stuff in this book. He says that Christianity is a human institution that fabricated the notion of a menacing creator for political ends. That humankind's role on earth is to be happy. And of course, in the 18th century, the idea of happiness is really a new concept. Think about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is an 18th century construct. He also says that human contentment, and by this he's kind of alluding to human sexual happiness, is not selfish or evil, but a necessary part of an aesthetic, moral feedback loop created by God. In other words, sex feels good because it makes, because it has to, because it creates good, a creative good, and it inspires people to have children. Now, by all measures, this view of the universe enthralled Diderot for a couple of years in the 1740s. He was able to believe in a God who would engineer the human species to be both moral and happy. And it allowed this failed priest to replace the Christian God with a new trinity, the good, the beautiful, and the true. 2 years later, in 1746, Diderot starts to slip, and his faith, or his interest in deism, starts to kind of crumble. And he publishes a far more combative book called the Philosophical Thoughts. And here we see a more combative stance toward the deity. Here's the frontispiece from that book. You can see philosophy ripping the mask off of superstition. But of course, if you were allegorically minded during the 18th century, you would say this is actually religion. Philosophy ripping the mask off religion. Now, he knows he's stepping into dangerous territory with this book. He let potential buyers know this on the title page by adding the Latin inscription, Piscis hic non est omnium, forgive my Latin, or this fish is not for everybody. And there's lots of heterodox, challenging ideas in the 62 thoughts, or pensées, in this book. Among other things, he lashes out against the idea of an implacable and cruel Old Testament deity. What purpose would such a God serve, he asks, given the fact that the supposedly all-powerful being only intervenes in the interest of his immediate worshippers and lets thousands die on a daily basis? Diderot had 4 kids, 3 of them died. A page later he writes, regarding the image of the deity that some people have painted, regarding his penchant for anger, regarding the rigor of his revenge, regarding the small number of people he lets perish compared to the small number to which he deigns, regarding the huge number of people he lets perish compared to the small number to which he deigns lend a hand, bearing all this in mind, the most upright soul would be tempted to wish that this God did not exist. And this is one of the most ardent moments of free thinking in the philosophical thoughts. In addition to the fact that Diderot invokes the so-called problem of evil, or the theodicy, he was also claiming the right to free himself from God. And there's several other memorable scientific and philosophical principles in the philosophical thoughts that are worth mentioning. These are my mantras as well. The first is a declaration: skepticism is the first step toward truth. The second is a logical clarification of this point. What has never been called into question has never been proven. And the third is a manifesto-like declaration of the right to think freely. One can demand of me that I seek truth, but not that I must find it. And these maxims herald a much more incredulous set of propositions vis-a-vis long-standing proofs of God's existence. Like Spinoza and Hobbes before him in the 17th century, Diderot declares that Scripture, with its somewhat arbitrary assemblage of manuscripts, is a purely human invention. He also suggests that miracles or prodigies that supposedly attest to a divine presence are but political tools employed by charlatans to enthrall and control the population's imbeciles. Incidentally, Diderot was Karl Marx's favorite writer. You can hear the opium of the people notion circulating in his mind. And finally, he states flatly that given what we can actually know, God is clearly not self-evident, nor necessarily the first mover. And nonetheless, in the philosophical thoughts, Diderot is still hesitating. At several points, he evinces a belief in a deist God by pointing to the wonders of nature as they've been discovered in the scientific disciplines ranging from celestial physics, talking about Newton, to the study of sperm by Nicholas Hartshorne. And in one famous phrase, he sums up the metaphysical implications of these scientific discoveries and the teleological argument in a really solemn way. He says, "We have found satisfying proof of the existence of a supremely intelligent being. Thanks to our great scientists, the world is no longer a god. It is a machine that has its wheels, its cords, its pulleys, its springs, and its weights." In other words, if one studies the infinitely small world, as discovered thanks to the microscope, and the infinitely large universe of mathematical perfection discovered by Newton, God's handiwork is there to be discovered. This is an optimistic moment in 1746. Now, to summarize, in parts of this book, Diderot asserts that the study of nature, science, allows it to detect the fingerprints of a supremely intelligent being. But the fact that Diderot's belief in God came from an examination of the world rather than Scripture also turned nature into a battlefield, and it remains a battlefield today. This is now the site of a winner-take-all game of philosophy. Indeed, the big and unresolved question that Diderot asks in the philosophical thoughts is this: does the scientific study of nature indicate a divine hand, or conversely, should we attribute this world to pure chance, the random assemblage of atoms? Diderot became a far more heterodox thinker 3 years later, age 35, 1749, same year he gets thrown into jail. And this is when he publishes the letter on the blind that I alluded to a little earlier. For the vast majority of this anonymously published book, Diderot examined a series of problematic philosophical questions. Some of these were linked to the altered cognitive state of the blind and Locke's Molyneux problem, which is something that we could talk about later. The letter is much more than a reflection on the lives of the unseen. As the subtitle of the book makes clear, the letter is destined for the use of those people who can see. Indeed, at the same time that Diderot examines this supposedly disadvantaged way of looking at the world, he also asks probing philosophical questions, such as, on what basis can a blind man claim to have an understanding of and relationship to God, since he can't see the miracle of creation? And second, why would God deprive the blind man of the best way to infer a divine presence? And this brings me to this nice oil portrait that you're looking at right here. This is the famous blind geometrician, mathematician, Nicholas Saunderson, who lived from 1682 to 1739. And this man was a genius. He was a good friend of Newton, a mathematician, who died, as you can see, or as I said, about 10 years before the book, Diderot's Letter on the Blind was written. Now, in speaking about this man, Diderot talks about his exquisite sense of touch, which develops over time, his uncanny ability to play with abstract ideas. He also created a system of palpable arithmetic. At the end of this section, however, Diderot announces abruptly that he is in possession of an unpublished manuscript. And this is entirely bogus archival source. And Diderot said, hey, I found this manuscript. And in the middle of this philosophical kind of discussion of blindness, we suddenly join this man, Saunderson, on his deathbed in 1739, and he's in conversation with a kind Protestant minister named Gervase Holmes. And given the seriousness of the moment, given the fact that Holmes is about to die, the two men take up the question of the deity. And on the face of it, it seems like the way this is all staged, that we're just about to witness a big deathbed conversion, which we see in 18th century novels quite a bit. But instead of accepting Christianity, instead of returning to the faith, Saunderson begins a brutal interrogation and refutation of the deist-based understanding of God that Diderot had been thinking through for the past 5 years. And this begins when, to prove the existence of God, the Protestant minister asks the dying man to contemplate the argument from design by touching his own corporeal existence. He says, run your hands over your body, and you will feel God in the admirable mechanism of your sense organs. And Saunderson refutes this optimistic view of the universe by claiming if there is a God, he has forsaken him because he cannot see these miracles. He says, ah, sir, forget this beautiful, great spectacle. It was not made for me. I have been condemned to live my life in darkness, and you cite wonders I can't understand, and which are proof only for you and those who see as you do. And then he says, memorably, if you want me to believe in God, you must make me touch him. Now, obviously, philosophically speaking, Saunderson's strange request to touch the deity has no real value within the overall discussion. And yet, the dying man makes an important point. Given the fact that he has no access to the comforting visual world upon which so much of the design argument for God's existence is founded, he is simply asking Holmes to reconcile the proposition of God with the sensory stimulus that the blind man can grasp, so to speak. But more than that, Saunderson also implicitly underscores the fact that nobody, seeing or not, has a suitable sensory organ that would allow him or her to assert conclusively that there is a God. By rights, Saunderson is arguing that given our understanding of the world, and based on the implicit idea that we should only draw conclusions based on what we know via experience, we should all be skeptics at the very least. And Saunderson even goes farther than this. He accuses the minister of falling prey to one of the characteristic failings of humankind in general, namely attributing metaphysical significance to things that could be understood with non-superstitious explanations. He says, if we think a phenomenon is beyond us, we immediately believe that it's God's work. Our vanity will accept nothing less. But couldn't we be a bit less vain and a bit more philosophical in what we say. If nature presents us with a problem that is difficult to unravel, let's leave it as it is, not try to undo it with the help of a being who then offers us a new problem far more insoluble than the first. Now, the authority of this atheist position becomes even clearer when, during the final throes of death, the blind man begins to hallucinate. And here we could see Diderot's evolution from a skeptic, a deist, or somebody who is not sure about God's existence, into an ideological materialist, someone who puts forward a new theory of the Genesis. And even an entirely godless explanation of nature, a nature that he portrays as dynamic and forever transforming. Saunderson and Diderot were not thinking about this kind of change taking place in the Galapagos Islands, for example. He's going back to his own defective body as his laboratory and as a clue to the previous disorder of the universe. Rejecting the idea of an orderly Genesis, Saunderson conjures up deep time, again thinking way past 5,700 years, a time of biological anarchy and a cosmic chaos from which a smattering of ordered beings and viable worlds eventually emerged or were selected. And the most dramatic, poetic vision of the first moments of life, among the most dangerous passages of Diderot's ever published during his lifetime, is worth quoting at length. When the universe was hatched from fermenting matter, my fellow men, meaning the blind men, were very common. Yet could not this belief about animals also hold for worlds? How many lopsided, failed worlds are there that have been dissolved and are perhaps being remade and redissolved every minute in faraway spaces, beyond the reach of my hands and your eyes, where movement is still going on and will keep going until the bits of matter arrange themselves in a combination that is sustainable. Oh, philosophers, come with me to the edge of this universe, beyond the point where I can feel and you can see organized beings. Wander across that new ocean with its irregular and turbulent movements and see if you can find in them any trace of that intelligent being whose wisdom you so admire here.
1749.
1749.
Wow.
So content-wise, and I'm sure there might be a couple of classicists in the audience kind of moving quickly on their seat, this is going to remind us a lot of a long-standing heterodox tradition that rejected revelation, miracles, the afterlife, and belief in creation, and also will remind us of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. What was new and dangerous in this quote was the fact that Diderot had allowed these heretical ideas to infuse contemporary philosophical debates. And he was also seeking actively to convey the joy of apostasy and the power of heterodox thinking. In short, through his blind spokesperson, Diderot implores his readers to free themselves from religious fantasy and the threat of a potentially fiery afterlife, to become rather the type of freethinkers who, among other things, are willing to think beyond God. Now, thinking beyond God, as I like to say, was Diderot's calling card. And it allowed him to think about things far removed from what we kind of now consider the natural history or scientific kind of arena. He rejects notions coming from the church related to human sexuality. He thinks that homosexuality actually can be conceived of both natural and to a certain extent normal. He questions the often religiously defined roles assigned to women. He identifies religious celibacy as a source of all sorts of sexual abuse in both convents and monasteries. He even thought about the slave trade from the perspective of an atheist and rejects many of the arguments related to the idea that enslaved Africans gave up their body but achieved eternal salvation. Now, in the final part of the talk, and certainly in the spirit of Darwin Day, I would give another example of how he thinks beyond God. 20 years later, 1769. And this is in a book called D'Alembert's Dream that Lisa and I were talking about very quickly here. Now, this is kind of the final point in his career, and Diderot was really preferring to think about the problems that remained after atheism was established as a given. He was no longer a militant atheist. And as I said, he was writing for the drawer, pour le tiroir, as they say in French. And this allowed him to think about far heavier questions, the kind of questions we ask ourselves these days. What is life? Who are we? Where do we come from? How are we changing as a species, both morally and physically? And to answer these questions in D'Alembert's dream, he once again conjures up an altered way of seeing the world. In The Letter of the Blind, dying man who is hallucinating because he's dying. And here we have a dreaming geometrician, a mathematician. And so he gives up empiricism and goes into the speculative mode to start talking about these things that he can't prove empirically because he's jumping way ahead of his era. And D'Alembert has this amazing nightmare. He has a nightmare after he's hanging out with Diderot. There's a big discussion about a lot of these ideas. He goes home, starts dreaming about this stuff as a skeptic, and it all kind of flows out. And D'Alembert's girlfriend writes the whole thing down, and that's the whole kind of setup for this book. Now, among other things, D'Alembert's feverish understanding of the world not only rejects the possibility of divine telos, or intent, in the fullness, it discards the increasingly classification-driven understanding of nature that was forming during the 18th century among naturalists such as Linnaeus. Linnaeus is the person, of course, who coins the expression Homo sapiens. And indeed, Diderot's view of the universe is a profoundly particulate understanding of reality, a reality where everything is linked, albeit at a kind of particulate or atomic level. He says, D'Alembert is saying as he's dreaming, the whole of the universe is constantly changing. Every species and all of nature is in a perpetual state of flux. Every animal is more or less a human being. Every mineral more or less a plant. Every plant more and less an animal. There's nothing clearly defined in nature. Now, related to this notion was the idea that nothing is really as it seems to us, even now. We all suffer from what he called the sophism of the ephemeral. And by this he means the misconception or delusion that the order that we see around us in this room at Franklin and Marshall is a mirage. He puts this in very stark terms in a different book. He says, form is a mask that deceives us all. All forms, according to Diderot, morphology, he's talking about morphology, stem from earlier prototypes that shifted and changed and survived due to particular circumstances or advantages. For example, he says, if the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg, bothers you, it's because you suppose that animals are now what they once were. That's madness. We don't know really. We don't know where animals were, who they were in the past, and we certainly don't know what they will become. Who knows? The earthworm that wiggles in the muck is perhaps on its way to becoming a large animal, maybe a whale. Now, this view of nature clearly had huge implications for the human species as well. And Diderot was painfully aware that science had done little to illuminate the history of the human race. You couldn't do it. You'd end up back in jail. Such a subject just did not lend itself to the disinterested and probing empirical examination that Diderot promoted either. Well into the 18th century, nature remained laden with these inflexible, religious, infused concepts. The notion of biblical time we talked about, and the idea that animals were exactly here, now, as they were at creation. And finally, there was the idea that humankind was unique. It had a rational mind and a higher spiritual nature, a soul. Now, to emphasize the kind of contingencies in his view of the human race, Diderot took a page out of the work of his good friend, Georges Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, the Count of Buffon, who was the keeper of the King's Garden in Paris. If you go to the Garden of Plants, it's called the Jardin des Plantes. In France now, this is where Buffon was hanging out. He was the most famous naturalist of his generation, and Diderot's generation. And he put forth the first kind of coherent, non-religious, well, not really non-religious, but pretty much non-religious theory of the human species. And he called this human degeneration. The idea was that there was a white prototype that degenerated in different climates. We can talk about the proto-raciological implications of this later on. But Diderot is not reacting to this in a kind of racist kind of way, but he's fascinated with the fact that humans can change over time. It's a dynamic view of nature because nature was static. And here, all of a sudden, nature has a history. And so he starts thinking about the supposedly most degenerate group of people on the planet, who are the Laplanders, according to everybody. From Diderot's perspective, this supposedly wretched and snow-dwelling branch of diminutive humans was not only on the kind of a degenerate group of people, but perhaps on the verge of its extinction. The idea of extinction is really also new at this time. He says, who knows whether that shapeless biped, a mere 4 feet in height, which is still called a man in polar regions, but which would soon lose that name if it went just a little bit more misshapen, is not an example of a disappearing species. Who knows whether this is not the case with all animal species? So this is interesting. This is a profoundly anthropocentric understanding of humankind in the 18th century, which is a profoundly anthropocentric century. The proper study of mankind, supposedly man, according to Alexander Pope. But from Diderot's point of view, all of us, all creation is just the result of matter and its inherent determinants, and the birth and the demise of the human species is no more significant than the delivery of a freakish two-headed pig. And this brings me to my final point, that Diderot loved the idea of gestation and birth and conception and the sex act and what happens as, it was the big metaphor for him in terms of trying to figure out what goes on in the natural world. At one point in the dream, he proposes an amusing Frankenstein-like a thought experiment in teratogenesis in French, the fabrication of monsters. And this is a wild science fiction type moment where the dreaming D'Alembert imagines intervening in the gestation process by manipulating speculative genetic material of embryos, what Diderot calls threads. Remember, this is 80 years before Mendel. This prescient scene not only debunks the supposed miracle of conception, but foreshadows our own world, one in which scientists have claimed the right to refashion human biology at the embryonic level. He says, well, actually this is, he says, now do mentally what nature sometimes does in reality. Take a thread from the bundle, the one destined to form the nose, and the creature will be noseless. Take away the one that should form the ear, and it will have no ears or only one ear. The anatomist in his dissection won't find either the olfactory or auditory threads, or find only one of the latter instead of two. Go on taking away threads, and the creature will be headless, footless, handless. It won't live long, but nevertheless, it will have lived. So this book, which is so interesting, really encourages us to recognize that the reassuring but spurious concepts that give meaning to human identity, by this I mean individuality, species, and even separation between what is normal and monstrous, are really illusions to a certain extent. And by the end of this book, we as readers understand that we have come into this world as something, as contingent flukes. We don't lead our lives without knowing who we are, and we recognize that we are walking on two sides of eternity, and we're returning to a bewildering world of matter without knowing why. And I should say about reading Diderot, it's anything but depressing. It's amazing. He loves life so much. He embraces this. The headiness of our existence is so interesting. And he's somebody who is really a humanist in many ways. For somebody who's kind of deconstructing the human condition on certain levels, he's a profound humanist. But talking about that side of his life would have to be another story. Thank you so much. Dr. Thompson.
Do we know for sure that Erasmus Darwin read the letter to the blind or D'Alembert's dream?
The question is, maybe I can answer a more general question. To what extent did Diderot have an influence in Darwin, if at all? In Darwin's correspondence, we do see general references to Diderot, nothing very specific. certainly references to the Encyclopédie, to kind of Diderot's overall worldview. But I was just reading about Diderot's influence in the 19th century, and I think it was Marx's goddaughter or something described Diderot as the ghost of the 18th century in many ways. And so his influence was just so huge because he was writing in a way where even until the 1950s, we didn't know exactly what he had published. He was often kind of ghostwriting for people as well. He was writing in the margins of other books. So as the historians of science will probably say in this room, there is no direct influence, and the kind of transformist thought he's talking about here can't be linked to the theory of evolution in a linear way. Still in all, Diderot was certainly responsible for putting forward a very dynamic understanding of nature, a view of nature where nature has a history, it's changing and shifting. And that, his contribution there certainly flows into Erasmus Darwin, and then I think that Charles Darwin as well.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So after I listening, this is my first time hearing actual lecture about Diderot, and I never.
You're not alone.
So like the things that I think describing like the whole world is like different subject and it has the different spiritual or like consciousness of matters. It's like I feel it is more like a ecosystem. Like nature has its own thinking or own feeling. And are we still adopting this idea in this modern 21st century? It's like a little bit behind like all of age, like we're using a 18th century people's philosophy or logic to persist out of our current issues and reference issues.
Yeah, so there's a question of, you might call it a diachronic question, which is to say you're talking about two different time periods, the relation between the two different time periods, and also the understanding of nature, and how the 18th century of nature may influence the way we're looking at the world today. So, big, deep question, a 45-minute answer I can't do right now, but certainly I think that we are the spiritual and the intellectual heirs of the 18th century, good and bad, right? So there's a very rationalistic understanding of the universe that comes out of the 18th century. Classification schemes, for example, racial classification schemes, for example. The word Caucasian, for example, comes from the idea from Blumenbach, who says that Noah's Ark lands in the Caucasus, and then from there, the different varieties show up. These are all kind of classification ideas, the hyper-rationalistic understanding of the world. At the same time, the liberal tradition of human equality, universalism, is part of the 18th century tradition as well. There's a very complicated, it's a complicated legacy that people have talked about. And so each person has to kind of grapple with that individually. To what extent do we accept these ideas, and we have to process them. And I think most people kind of deal with both. We are rejecting some of the things which are the kind of nefarious legacy of the Enlightenment era, and also certainly you know, some of the more very progressive ideas come out of the Enlightenment as well. Thank you.
I'd love to know what you think Diderot would have thought reading Darwin.
So the question is, what would Diderot think reading Darwin? I think he would have been absolutely mesmerized by Darwin. To actually think of, to see the implementation of many of the ideas that he and Buffon and Lamétrie and Delbach, his kind of coterie of thinkers who would get together in a salon with about 25 people. They really couldn't talk about this anywhere. Diderot read D'Alembert's Dream at a country house, making sure no one's around, right? So seeing this moment in 1859 and later on in the 19th century where the idea of a dynamic nature and matter and its inherent determinants being the explanation for who we all are and who the world, all the creatures in the world would have been just fantastic for him. He would have been just delighted, I think.
When you think about some of what Diderot's thoughts were moving away from theism, you talk about his idea of the pursuit of happiness and the replacement of the Christian Trinity with the Trinity of the good, true, and beautiful. To me, that doesn't sound like very new ideas, which is sort of the impression I got from what you were saying.
Yeah.
It seems more like a return to old classical Greek philosophy. And admittedly, like the Christian tradition had sort of appropriated some of Aristotle and Plato. Is Diderot sort of reappropriating this and stripping the Christian overtones away from that, or yeah, how do you understand the historicity of this?
Yeah, so the question is kind of the, to what extent is Diderot doing things that are new? To what extent is Diderot doing things which are actually, recycled or vulgarized? And certainly he's a great student of antiquity. In terms of some of the ideas relating to happiness, he absolutely is going back to antiquity. He's a great scholar of Seneca, for example, and Stoics. And so he writes a book on Seneca as well. It's one of the last things he does. So he's a great, great student of particularly the Romans. And when it comes to the ideas that are the deist ideas, most of these actually come from England. So he's actually a translator. And so those ideas are not new because they have come from antiquity, been recycled, reprocessed, and then they have to kind of become compatible with this understanding of the world where Newton is saying you can see. And Newton is also has this deist philosophy or deist kind of approach where you can see God's order in this fabulous mathematical order. So there's a number of people reacting to this in a very, very different way in the 18th century. It is an interesting moment of deism. It lasts for 30, 40 years or something like that. So it's not terribly new in a lot of ways. At the same time, it does speak to a particular moment. But you're right, Diderot is recycling a lot of things at this point. Some of his later stuff is certainly much more kind of out there.
So I'm grappling a little bit with probably I think you said diachronic, or thinking across these different time periods. So Steve Gould had this notion that religion and science they were sort of separate domains of understanding. And from your discussion of Diderot, it's almost like it's rejection of religion or religious explanations to kind of explore the dynamic nature of his environment. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, if you start at that point in the 18th century and then you find yourself towards the present where there are some or many scientists who would see themselves as both religious and also exploring the world in this free-thinking way. Can you at least allude to some of the folks that followed Diderot that made that possible, or is it just totally opposite, like alternative branches?
Yeah, so the question is this question of the dichotomy between science and religion, and as Stephen Jay Gould talks about as well, it's these kind of two different kind of epistemological systems. I've always thought there's a way more syncretism that we allow for in our scholarship. Certainly the 18th century, even among the most kind of forward-thinking, quote-unquote, progressive, quote-unquote, thinkers, much of what they're thinking about is just full of religious ideas. I've studied race for many years, and one of the things I've found that people haven't really talked about is the influence of religion on race among the most avant-garde thinkers of the 18th century. The view of, I talked about Blumenbach and Buffon, saying that this original prototype race, without mentioning the Bible at all, that it degenerates and moves into different territories. Well, what is that? That's a retelling of the Bible, of Genesis. It's compatible with the Bible and Genesis, even though it's scientific. They might get in trouble because it's not going back to Scripture, but it's absolutely compatible to put forward a polygenetic explanation of the human species, saying that there's separate species, separate origins, was so heretical that no one really did it. And so you can see that science at the time is adapting to that thing. And I think that your point is a good one, that since that time, there are many people, Darwin, take one example, is grappling very heavily with the question of faith. And, is called an atheist many times and adopted by atheists as kind of a poster boy. But he is probably more of an agnostic. Now, there's real experts in the room who know way more about Darwin than I do. But certainly, there's if you are a skeptic overall, if that's your approach, what hasn't been, if skepticism is the first step toward truth, refuting the existence of God, I'm speaking French now, refuting the existence of God in a completely dogmatic way goes against your skepticism, because that can't be proven either. So I think that there are certainly kind of spaces where these things operate together still. Jim.
In some ways, this is following on the tail of that. I mean, I'm really struck by your saying that this view of the universe as just molecules randomly mixing around. You know, take away one thread and it has no legs or arms. And that this enterprise for Diderot is exciting, is positive, is joyful. I mean, throughout the 19th century, we're told over and over again that one of the reasons why Western culture is repulsed by Darwinism is because they simply cannot tolerate this randomness in the world without it making everybody completely depressed. And I don't think that our society has got past that problem today. Yet for him, it's not that way. Why doesn't everybody read this as a joyful enterprise the way Diderot does?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this emptiness that we're talking about in Diderot, this idea that it's hard to put forward a world of meaning given the fact that he has his vision, a material vision of the world. It's interesting, and that I think there's a couple things I can say about this. First, on the biographical level about Diderot, this is his text that he writes. It doesn't show to very many people. It's a complete folly, right? So it's a folly. And so it's not something he's publishing to kind of, change the way people are thinking at the time. He knows when it's published in 1830 that people are going to kind of go crazy for this or really find this to be scandalous, and they certainly do. 70 years later, boom, it pops open. At the same time, I think he actually constructed a philosophy, a materialist philosophy of happiness, which is certainly reminiscent of some ideas from antiquity. I mean, the Lucretian idea as well, right? But at the same time, he is going to take this vitalism and talk about the material world as happiness existing almost on a molecular level. He says to his mistress, Sophie Baudon, when we die, I hope that they will put our bodies together, they'll meld and we'll grow into something together differently. Our molecules will come together in this kind of fabulous, beautiful, enchanted materialism. And so his materialism is something that transcends the material. It's many ways. There's almost a metaphysical side to the whole thing. And he loved people. One of the big differences between Rousseau and Diderot, for example, is Rousseau loved the human race, but didn't get along with people. And Diderot loved the human race, and he loved people. No offensive. Any students have questions?
Do you mind asking?
Sure.
So you mentioned Diderot greatly impacted Karl Marx. Can you explain how?
Sure.
Because I figure out Karl Marx.
You couldn't see it here at all. So the question is, how did Diderot influence Karl Marx and Freud? So he really was the favorite person of the avant-garde in Europe during the 19th century, not so much the United States. But so with Marx, he wrote a book called Rameau's Nephew, in which he talks about, he kind of deconstructs Enlightenment philosophy, which is progress. Progress and education and human knowledge, freeness, all from these occult ideas from the past. That's the optimistic idea of the Enlightenment. And he deconstructs this in Rameau's Nephew by conjuring up this guy who represents the kind of the downtrodden. And this guy rips apart this optimistic idea of where we're going and talks about life and social class in this incredibly mechanical way. And Marx just thought this was fantastic. This materialist, right? Materialist understanding of social class and the functioning and how it works and how it's almost impossible to get ahead. It's a very sociological text. It's hilarious and bizarre, but it's an amazing thing. It was, I think, it was certainly Marx's favorite Diderot book, for sure.
So you talked about the joy that comes through in his writing. I'm wondering, like when I hear people talk like that, it makes me think of like Facebook pictures where like people smile at the camera, and it also kind of seems to me weirdly anthropocentric. I mean, there's impression management going on there, right? And I'm sort of wondering why. Could you articulate why you think that's important, or if it is important?
So I don't quite understand the question. So why the joy of reading is anthropocentric?
No, the joy that is expressed through his word. If I've read you correctly, you suggested that it's important, and I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think that, like many philosophers who understand or talk about the human condition, Diderot was profoundly aware that, in his most pessimistic moments, he said, life is about going to the bathroom really well and getting a good night's sleep, and he says some other stuff too that I'm not going to repeat. So he's able to bring life down to its basis elements. At the same time, as a person, you can see, when we see descriptions of him, he was an astonishing talker and a fabulous conversationalist. And yes, there's an anthropocentric sense to what he's doing. He's both deconstructing the human condition, but taking great joy in the fact that this is so new. He loves peeling back the curtain on different things, including who we are as humans, at least as a joke. Remember, he's doing this for 25 people when he's writing this initially. And his whole idea is to reveal things that can't be seen. So the Encyclopédie, 3,000 illustrations of various trades that have never been seen before. Showing the machinery behind the theater. He loves showing stuff that hasn't been seen before, pulling back the curtain on scientific processes, dissection studies, the old images from Vesalius, everything. He wants to show things. He takes great joy in that. And yes, it is anthropocentric. And at the same time, he's got this other side to him where he is trying to, at least with his friends, share what he thinks about who we all are as creatures.
Tony here.
So, I'd like to go back to your point about how you said that Diderot's beliefs have come to question the social order ordained by the church in terms of creating roles for women and damnation of homosexuality. I was wondering, what would an alternative and ideal social order and governance look like in Diderot's opinion?
So the question is, so Diderot at least talks about social reform in several of his texts, including homosexuality, rights for women, and that one is mixed, and slave trade, against the slave trade. And the question is, did he actually put forward something that could be construed as a superior moral order or new social order? He was so worried during his lifetime that things were kind of going down and regressing, particularly toward the end of his life. To think about, we're in the 18th century, the kings are getting progressively more conservative. Louis XVI, who gets his head chopped off, starts off as a reformer, but then goes back into kind of conservatism. Louis XV was tremendously tough on Diderot, denies him for being elected to the Académie Française, and also, threatens to throw him into jail, shuts down the Encyclopédie twice. He's persecuted throughout his entire life. It's very hard for him to envision a social order without radical change. And we discovered in the 1950s that he had written extensive parts of a book called The History of the Two Indies. And that may be the book where you would find some of this stuff. And this was a book written by this guy named Raynal, R-A-Y-N-A-L. And in this book, he is talking to Americans. He's talking to the Brazilians. He's talking to the French people. And he's talking about the fact that there really can't be any kind of, we've reached a kind of boiling point, and the fact that people are starving in France at this point, there's more and more bread famines, means that revolution is probably going to be coming. He talks about the fact that, in the French Caribbean, there will certainly be a revolt very soon. He says that he essentially predicts the Haitian Revolution 10 years before it happens. Says it's going to be a black Spartacus who will arise. He is kind of talking about Toussaint Louverture. It's really astonishing. But he didn't have a kind of a utopian kind of understanding of what the future could be. In fact, he was very nervous. This gigantic encyclopedia project he did, he thought it would be a repository of knowledge for future generations who might be able to pull it out and fix things after the fall. Right? So that whole thing was a repository for knowledge at certain times. At the same time, he probably was not thinking about overthrowing the monarchy. He would have been perfectly happy if the monarchy just left people alone. That's what he wanted. He was not a revolutionary, really. Philosophically he was, intellectually he was, politically he may have been at the end of his life, but he didn't have, he wasn't writing political theory like Rousseau is writing political theory, and that would be another question. But he certainly was diagnosing a lot of evils of the time period. He said that it's crazy that women are half the population and their lives are essentially ruined by the other half. He really was talking about, in this Randall's Nephew book I talking about the situation of people who just can't, who are struggling. There's enormous income inequality at that time, and he knew that this was creating a powder keg, as he called it. So a lot of diagnosis, not a lot of solution, I have to say.
And for our time. Our speaker will be around between 1:30 and 2:30 for a more informal conversation, but perhaps we could give him some thanks now and let him get something to eat.
Thank you very much. Happy Darwin Day. Happy Valentine's Day.
Hang around until 1:30 if you want more conversation.